Quickly before I get into the video, if you could drop a like on it and subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to hit 20k as soon as possible, and that would be greatly appreciated. Anyways, let's get into the video. Look, I've talked about John Wall to the Houston Rockets, and now I think that affects that team. It's now time to talk about Westbrook to the Wizards and what that does for Bradley Beal and all those guys over in Washington. Now, I've just got to say one thing. Everyone's talking about how this trade is pointless, how it's a sideways trade. What's the point of making a trade like this? It's not 2K. Not every time you make a trade are you expecting to fleece the other team. There's a number of reasons. One of them can be chemistry. For example, there's been plenty of rumors about Wall not being happy with Beal being the number one option, about Wall not wanting to be in Washington at all. The same goes for Westbrook in Houston. He actually declared that he wanted out. All of these things lead to chemistry issues, which is a major thing. It doesn't show up in the stat sheet, and maybe you just look at the two players and think, oh, they've got similar play styles, so the trade is just, it doesn't do anything at all. That's not quite the case. There's a few more things that go into it, and I think Washington have got better. If you want my thoughts on what Houston have done, then I talked about that in another video, but we're here to talk about Washington, and I think the only loser from this trade is the Atlanta Hawks, because they were crowned the 8th seed pretty much immediately after making some signings. I wasn't convinced. I think they've made some good signings, but there's still a lot of question marks over that team. It's a very young team. Can Trae Young lead a team? I know he's fantastic offensively. His defense is absolutely non-existent, and the same can be said for a few of their new signings. I wasn't yet to crown them the 8th seed. I know the East's 8th seed was kind of weak, and people want to talk about how if Westbrook can do it in the West, it's easier to do it in the East. Well, the top 7 seeds in the East and West, I don't think there's too much between them. It's more the 8th seed and the 9th and the 10th seed, those kind of bottom 3 seeds of the playoff picture. And I guess that's the difference, and that's why I think Westbrook is pretty much assured the Wizards are going to make the playoffs. I'm pretty confident a team with Russell Westbrook and Bradley Beal are very likely to make the playoffs. You can talk about Westbrook all you want. I've had a lot of criticisms for him. His shooting, his turnover-prone play, just a lot of things that he does in the playoffs. But what you can't say is during the regular season, he always performs. You can't talk about anything other than him performing in the regular season, him playing a lot of the game, him playing at 100% all of those games, him putting up numbers, him putting up wins. He'll piggyback a team if he needs to, and then he'll be able to operate with a star if he needs to as well. Sure, he might not be the ideal second option or the ideal co-star, but he can still work with a star. I mean, it worked with Kevin Durant to a degree, it worked with Paul George, and it's probably going to work with Bradley Beal, also James Harden. They got to the playoffs. All these teams have made it to the playoffs. There's never been a disastrous result, and I expect Washington to be the same. In terms of the trade for Washington, I think it's a win. As I said, there's chemistry issues with Wall, and just in general, Russell Westbrook has a lot less question marks over himself than Wall has. Russell Westbrook has a lot less question marks than John Wall, and that's saying something. Westbrook's got a few question marks, but what you can't question is his health at the moment. He's had some knee injuries, but he's still getting himself on the floor, and he continues to do so. You can't question whether he's a top 30 or so player in the league. He's still towards that end of the scale. He's still a good player, and he's still particularly a good regular season player. I think people forget how good he was from the month of January through to pretty much the bubble. He then had an injury. He then had a few issues, and in the playoffs he struggled. But to his credit, he did look a bit less explosive. He did look a bit injured. I mean, he came into the playoffs after suffering an injury, and he was potentially underdone. So you can look back at the months beforehand, and he was one of the best players in the league during that stretch. So if we get that kind of Westbrook in Washington, they're definitely making the 8th seed without question. And then you look at the potential duo of him and Bradley Beal. I think it's going to be interesting to see who's going to have the ball more in their hands. Beal is someone that can operate off ball, and that's a good thing. But at the same time, he did put up 30 and 6, and he was the primary guy on the offense, and he wants to take that next step. You know, he wants to become the best shooting guard in the NBA, and he's not going to do that being the second fiddle, so he wants to be the number one guy. And whether Westbrook can negotiate that with Beal and whether they can kind of be the co-guys, that would be ideal. Westbrook take the playmaking duties, get to the rim, do all of those things that he's great at, and Beal take on a lot of the shot pressure, take on some playmaking duties as well, them split minutes and do things that a lot of superstar players have been able to do to get the best out of each other. There's no reason these two shouldn't work because their play styles are quite complementary of each other. The defense is a bit of an issue, and we're going to talk about that, but in terms of offensively, they do complement each other to some degree, and I think that's going to be interesting going forward. I think in general, this Washington team's actually got a bit of talent. You can look at teams that Westbrook's been on. Obviously, that Thunder team when he won MVP springs to mind, and they've had less talent than what he has now. He's playing alongside Bradley Beal, a top 25 player in the NBA, who's got potential to get even better and probably would be regarded as higher if his team won a bit more. He's playing alongside one of the best shooters in the league, Davis Bertans. And then I think Rui will be at the 4 and Bryant at the 5. Unless Danny shows something, you put him at the 3, Bertans at the 4, and Bryant at the 5. But at the moment, I'd have Russ, Beal, Bertans, Rui, and Bryant. And the key thing is, 3 of these 5 guys are shooters. Bryant can stretch the floor as a center. Bertans, as I've said, one of the best shooters in the league, and the same can be said for Beal. Sure, his shooting efficiency has taken a bit of a hit, but he takes a lot of tough shots, and just a lot of shots in general, and tries to generate so much offense that his shooting efficiency numbers are pretty much always going to take a hit. But in general, he's still one of the better shooters in the league. Like, we know what he is, so he's a great shooter as well. And then you have Rui, who can't really shoot. That could be a question mark, but it's not like Russ hasn't negotiated ways to work around playing with non-shooters. We've seen what he's done with his Thunder. He never had a shooting big man. He had Steven Adams the whole time. At times he was playing with Roberson. He was playing with guys that couldn't particularly shoot, and he still managed to work around it. So to have 3 shooters on the floor, at the very least, is pretty good. So I think that's fine in terms of shooting, and in terms of offense, I like that. I like the bench as well. You've got Troy Brown Jr., you've got Robin Lopez, Ish Smith, Mo Wagner, and then one of Rui or Denny, who obviously isn't starting. One of them's going to come off the bench and provide some kind of a spark. So you've got some scoring off the bench. You could even have Troy Brown Jr. in the starting lineup. I mean, he's younger than Rui. He's potentially going to take another step. He's taken a step, and he's an impressive player, so maybe he starts. It's yet to be seen. And they've got a few different options at that position, and I think that makes things interesting. But in general, I do think the Wizards have a solid lineup. I think they were in contention for the 8th seed. They were probably my 8th seed if Wall got back to full health over the Hawks, and now you bring in Westbrook, who has less question marks, and immediately just makes your team better in the regular season. He's a floor raiser. That's what he does. He raises your team's floor and just makes the playoffs. Question his playoff ability, question everything else about him, his shooting, everything. You can't question what he does, and that's win games in the regular season, and I expect nothing less alongside a lineup that has enough talent to get the 8th seed, heck, maybe even the 7th or 6th seed if a few things go right for the Wizards. You never know. I think it's going to be interesting to see what Beal can do, because people don't give Westbrook enough credit for what he did for Paul George. We saw how George struggled this year. He had his best year of his career coming back from an injury. People never thought he'd get back to his best. He had his best year of his career alongside Westbrook, and a lot of it has to do with his catch and shooting numbers. A lot of it has to do with himself as well. George was just incredible that year and the best player on the team, but who was facilitating that? Who was the man running the offense? Who was the man creating a lot of those open looks? It was Russell Westbrook. So you can think that maybe Russell Westbrook can get the best out of Bradley Beal and increase his shooting percentage, his shooting numbers, and get him a lot of open looks, because that's what he does for his teammates, and I expect the same to be done for Bertans and Thomas Bryant as well. And hopefully Rui can start to stretch the floor, or someone else can do that, because if they could have 4 floor spaces around Russ, that would be ideal. That would make this team a hell of a lot better, and all of a sudden this team looks pretty solid. I think another reason this trade might be important from the Wizards' perspective is, sure, the players in question, Wall and Russ, might be on a similar level when both healthy, but one thing that you have to keep in mind is Wall obviously wasn't healthy. You need to keep Bradley Beal happy. He is your franchise. He's 25, 26. He's younger than both of these guys, and he's the guy you want to keep happy. And by keeping him happy, you need to make the playoffs, and this improves your chances of making the playoffs. I'm sorry, Wall could be a better fit in Houston, and I've talked about that, and he could potentially be a better player if he gets back to full health, but those are some big ifs. What's not a big if is whether Westbrook's going to bring your team to the playoffs. I'm pretty certain of that. I'm almost certain if these two stay healthy, that's a playoff team. I'm actually pretty excited to see this team, because I think Westbrook's copped a lot of slander. Some of it has been warranted, but at the same time, we forget how good he was during those few months where he was unleashed, where he had the run of the offense, and he started getting to the rim, attacking the rim, kicking out, and now he's got a shooting center. He's got a sniper in Davis Bertans. He's got another sniper in Beal. He's got some good floor spacing, and when he has floor spacing, he really thrives. Let's put his playoff mess to the side for a bit. As I've said, I think he was a bit injured. I think he can really do a job in Washington, and I don't think it's a sideways trade. I think both teams benefit in a way. Chemistry, at the very least, is going to be different. It's going to be a different mix for both teams. Sometimes you just need to restart, and I think for both teams to kind of get a similar deal, to get similar players, but different chemistry, maybe a different look, a few different things that go into it, That's a win for me, and the only loser, as I've said, is the Atlanta Hawks, because they've gone from people's sure thing to make the 8th seed to definitely below the Wizards in my rankings. I can't see them getting above the Wizards. They're going to have to get in over another team, and that's unlikely to be any of the other teams because the Eastern Conference is pretty damn strong. Is it the right move for the Wizards to go all in and try to compete for a playoff series now when they could tank and rebuild and do all of those things like everyone's mentioned? Well, I mean, they're trying to keep Bradley Beal, they're trying to keep him happy, and they're trying to make the playoffs. Some teams are more content with making the middle seeding of the playoffs and trying to go 2 rounds or go 3 rounds and then hoping eventually something clicks. Like, it's not necessarily all about tanking. I've talked about this a lot. And you look at teams like Phoenix, when they were tanking and there was no culture and they just kept losing. Look at guys like Josh Jackson, Dragan Bender. Maybe they were just terrible picks, but at the same time, you have to look at the development and think there's a reason so many of these players aren't panning out, and I think it's got a lot to do with culture. So keeping the culture and keeping someone like Russell Westbrook to mentor a lot of these younger players and just get them into a winning environment, there's something in that. And they do have some good young talent. They've got Denny, they've got Rui, Thomas Bryant's not very old, Troy Brown Jr. is not very old. They're still going to have a draft pick next year. They're still going to be able to get young players. It's not like you can't get young players later in the draft. I think it's a win-win trade for both situations, and I definitely think it's a win for Washington because they know what they're getting, and what they're getting is someone that helps them win now, and that seems to be what they want to do. So if that's what they want to do, then they did this, and I'm happy for Washington. If you did enjoy the video, a like would be greatly appreciated. Other than that, I'll catch you next time. Bye.